Dear BILGESAM YouTube followers, today I'd like to introduce you our guest, Professor Donald Jensen. Donald Jensen is the Director for Russia and Strategic Stability at the United States Institute of Peace. He joined this institution after some years with the Center for European Policy Analysis, where he was a senior fellow and editor-in-chief. Dr. Jensen writes extensively on Russian domestic politics and Russian foreign and security policies, and also he specializes in the domestic and foreign policies of other post-Soviet states, especially Ukraine, Georgia, Baltic republics. Dr. Jensen received his bachelor's from Columbia University and his master's and a PhD from Harvard University. It's also important to mention that Donald Jensen was a senior fellow at some other institutions like Center for Transatlantic Relations at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, Center for European Policy Analysis, and the most important, he was former American diplomat. Dr. Jensen provided technical support for the START, INF, and SDI negotiations and was a member of the first 10-man U.S. inspection team to inspect Soviet missiles under the INF Treaty in 1988. From 1996 until 2008, he was Associate Director of Broadcasting and Head of the Research Division at the Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, where he helped lead organization's expansion into new broadcast regions after the end of the Cold War and adaptation of multimedia technology to deal with the challenge of the 21st century. It's also important to mention that Dr. Jensen was a foreign policy advisor to the presidential campaign of Governor John Kasich in 2016. As I mentioned, his research areas are mainly post-Soviet geographies, including Russia and Ukraine. Today, we are going to speak about NATO's 2030 agenda. As we know, 2 weeks ago, approximately, leaders of NATO member states met in Brussels and they agreed on this agenda. So, again, welcome, Mr. Jensen. Please explain us what is the meaning of this new agenda? What should we expect from this agenda? Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you, sir. Great to be here. As I mentioned before, we're on the air. Istanbul remains one of my favorite cities in the world, and glad to help out with a great university there. I thought what I would do in a short time I have allotted to me today is to do two things, really. One would be to make some comments on the NATO report, the communique, and what the NATO seems to have in mind. And second, I want to add my own opinions, evaluations, and maybe be a little bit provocative about NATO and its future, and about some of the things in the report, Elnur, which were said very explicitly, and some of the things which were quieter and need, I think, some emphasis, because it's an important time, obviously. It's a challenging time, and I think we have to be ready for some of the new kinds of issues that the alliance will face. To begin with, I recommend the NATO Communique, published on June, 3 weeks ago, as you said, and I think it defines the alliance in a very forward-looking, valuable way. It outlines an ambitious agenda. It talks about the challenges facing the alliance. They list global competition, unpredictable threats such as climate change, pandemic, cyber attack, disruptive technologies, climate change, and of course, above all, great power competition between Russia and China. This is the challenge NATO faces, It's interesting, of course, that it's much more complicated than the environment in which NATO was founded so many years ago. But I think it's a credit to NATO and the alliance that they have continued to reinvent themselves in some ways as the global environment, the global security environment has changed. 20 years ago, what were we talking about? We were talking about terrorism, threats from Islamic fundamentalism, other kinds of issues related to that. We saw the U.S. and NATO security establishment change from the Cold War to dealing with those kinds of threats, especially after 9/11. But now we've got a new environment, as I just said, and as the NATO communique says as well. And we're going to have to now pivot back to focusing on some new challenges, even as China rises, even as the U.S. itself is debating whether to focus more on China or Russia as we undertake our own strategic review. But let's go back to the communique. And I should say, for those of you in the audience who are interested, I highly recommend, which only mentions in passing in the communique, which is the NATO, it's called the Reflection Group report, which, Secretary General Stoltenberg commissioned about a year and a half ago. And it's about 75 pages, and it's excellent. And I say that not just because I know two of the authors, but it deals with some of these challenges in a great, great detail. And I urge, for those of you who are interested, to please go beyond just the communique and take a look at the deeper, more thorough report. So what does the communique call for? Number one, deeper political consultation and coordination among the alliance members, and it defines it. Number two, strengthening deterrence and defense of the alliance members. I'll have more to say on that in a second. Third, improved resilience. Resilience is one of those terms, Elnur, that is new. It's used to talk about our capability of resisting, particularly Russian, but also Chinese hybrid threats. Number four, to keep NATO's technological edge in its military and in civil military relations. Five, to uphold the rules of the so-called rules-based international order. You hear that talked about all the time. It reflects a consensus among the alliance members that the global system is bound and operates by certain common assumptions. That is a key problem, as I'll mention in a second, because Russia and China, especially Russia, do not accept or believe in that rules-based international order. They talk about boosting training of NATO soldiers. They talk about adapting to new challenges like climate change. And then the communique talks about NATO's beginning to conduct an entire strategic review of the alliance and the threat that's happening. And that is expected to begin very soon. So to NATO's credit, and to the credit of NATO compared to some other international organizations, NATO has been flexible despite its size. NATO has adopted, I think, overall very well. And NATO has, I think, positioned itself really to deal with the challenges of the next decade in a very effective and way that I think will be constructive. Now, Americans, Elnur, are always talked about, and they also mentioned the need to have its members pay their financial obligations. I wanted to avoid that a little bit. But, Americans, Elnur, are always talked about as being too optimistic. So I wanted to make several points about the report and about NATO at this time, at this moment, and perhaps stimulate a little bit of discussion. Because some of the stuff in the report and in the communique, I would word perhaps a little bit differently. Some of the stuff in the material and in the communique and the reflection report is, I think, in need of some development, even though I very much agree with what's contained therein. So let me go over some of those points for you and for the listeners in a way that probably is a little less optimistic, but also, I hope, balanced. First of all, I think we need to talk about, and so I would say some of these points, because of the political situation, cannot be put in the report, so I will say them. Number one, I think that we need to pay very close attention to Russia. That's an obvious thing to say, but I think we need to pay attention to Russia in a certain kind of way. Number one, when we talk, as the report does, about the rules-based international order, we have to realize that Russia does not play by those rules, and Russia does not agree with that international order. They see the system as victimizing Russia, and they see the system as led by NATO and the United States as trying to weaken Russia. And this is something that cannot be said in that report, but has to be kept in mind every time we look at Russia's comment, whether it's in Ukraine or in the Baltic or whatever. This is a fundamental way they look at international politics. That's number one. Number two is that a lot of what Putin says, and you may have listened to his direct line call-in yesterday, is implicitly about Russian domestic politics, even when he talks about foreign policy. Because I do think there is a sense in the Kremlin that the regime is vulnerable, that the regime is surrounded by enemies, the United States and NATO above all. And so you see the constant discussion of this kind of thing in public discussion in Moscow by Russian officials. And thus regime protection is a key variable. You can't look at Russia's activity in Ukraine without talking about how that activity that Putin sees as a potential problem. Now, Russia's fully aware of its strategic weakness or secondary position vis-a-vis NATO, vis-a-vis the United States. So one thing the Kremlin likes to do is just to create chaos, trouble, for its own sake. Russia, I think, believes that undermining the West, and I would include Turkey most certainly in that, that's what gives Russia a strategic advantage that compensates for its strategic weakness vis-a-vis what it regards as its adversaries. And finally, as a question about Russia, before I get to the others, is that it's not clear to anybody, least of all to me, whether Russia is a declining power, or is Russia an ascending power, or is Russia status quo power? It's not at all clear, and the economy is not doing very well. But Putin seems to be quite willing and able, and often effective, in causing trouble for the West, even though Russia is so significantly weaker. And we have to keep that in mind. And it's not clear whether Russia will be more or less active in 2030. Okay? Second, excuse me, back to the report, I would say that we have to be very careful when we talk about arms control and European security. My title is Strategic Security, and I think we have to look at arms control as we inherited it from the Cold War as really a security architecture that is in decline. There are new developments that are undermining that are weakening that, and NATO, in the report mentioned, but I might have said it more explicitly, is having to deal with issues like new weapons, cyber, drones, space, which no one has had to deal with before and which are new threats. And the architecture we have and which NATO has inherited is not adequate to deal with those challenges. The issue between conventional and strategic weapons in Europe is not clear. What does deterrence mean? What does deterrence mean when the weapons, high velocity, for example, that are being developed are so powerful and so strong, and they're not even nuclear? So what you're seeing now, and I think it's going to be the basis of the U.S.-Russian relationship, is beginning discussions about that. And that will include NATO, invariably, that will have to include NATO, especially in terms of European security. Third, I think NATO understandably cannot talk about the internal tensions within the alliance. You cannot put that in a document, but I think we see it almost every week. Most recently, last week, when the Eastern and Central European NATO partners effectively rejected the Merkel-Macron initiative out to the Kremlin. And I think this is just the latest of many, many examples of the Central and Eastern Europeans being nervous about an alliance that is so big, that is sometimes a little bit awkward, and whose members have very different understandings of their security needs. Two more points, and I will turn it back to you. It did the alliance, the document, both the communique and the report, said almost nothing about NATO expansion. Now, I understand very well how sensitive that is, but I think this gray area where Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova are sort of hung out there waiting for something, waiting to end corruption or waiting for this or that. I'm not sure how long that can go on, because I think without a clearer, and it doesn't have to be NATO membership, but a clearer commitment by the West to the security of those countries, and I include Georgia, I think Putin is going to continue to probe, continue to make trouble, and I think it doesn't serve anybody's interest to have the question of expansion so indefinitely postponed. I understand the objections. If you say we're going to expand to Ukraine or Georgia or wherever, Moldova, it is a provocative thing for the Kremlin. Yeah, it's a provocative thing for the Kremlin, but it might be coming up with a formulation that makes those countries more permanent partners. We've talked about that many times. A more clear and explicit guarantees of security, I think, would establish some red lines which the Russians are not likely to cross, at least with conventional military activity. And since I'm dealing with my Turkish friends to say, I would say that another very important, critical topic and a sensitive topic is, of course, Turkey's role in the alliance. And I'm one of those people who think that it's extremely important to have Turkey not only as an ally of the United States, but as a member of NATO, a valuable a member of NATO. And we've seen all they've done in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And I think this issue, not in the report, must be a central concern. That is to say, improve the relationship. And I think it can be improved in the coming decade. And that will make NATO a stronger alliance. We're never going to agree on everything, but I think the relationship needs to be less irritating to both sides and focus really more on our common security interests rather than the things that divide us. I am done. I'll turn it back to you, sir, and glad to talk about any of these questions. And as you mentioned earlier, we could talk about Ukraine and Russia too, if you'd like.
Of course. Thank you very much for a good start with explanation of NATO agenda. Actually, there are a lot of questions which I'd like to ask. I'd like to start with the question, the character of the international system. As we know, after the end of the Cold War, there was a period, we called it post-Cold War. And after some years, there was a new kind of explanation, like new Cold War period. So how do you think, is it right to call this era, which especially you have mentioned in your speech, NATO-Russia relations, this kind of crisis between United States and Russia, is it really the best explanation to call this period as new Cold War era? How do you think?
Eldor, my answer is yes, but. And yes, I think the relationship is as bad as it has been since 1991. And I will tell you, I was a diplomat in Moscow, as you said at the time, during the coup. And I thought finally Russia has made a democratic transformation, a breakthrough that will make Russia, and it seemed the case for several years, Russia would be a productive member of European security and all the other important institutions that Europe has made. It didn't happen. Now, Is this a Cold War? Well, it's not, in the sense that the Cold War was animated by ideologies, democracy versus Soviet totalitarianism or Soviet communism. And those were very different competing and inimical agenda ideologies. If you think the term Cold War should include ideology, then yes. Then no, it's not a new Cold War. However, I don't look at that. I'm not that interested in the theoretical debate about ideology. I'm interested in the quality of the relationship, which is bad. I'm interested in how we can improve the relationship. And thus, you can call it that if you want. I think it's better to say the relationship needs a lot of work, and it's the worst since the Cold War. But it's really up to the individual expert and analyst. It, in some ways, however, is more troubling now, because by the 1980s, late 1980s, when I worked on arms control myself, as you said, there was a level of, I won't say trust, nor there was a level of understanding by both sides about what was the rules, how we would do things, and then what were the areas where you couldn't go beyond. And I think a key role, of course, in that evolution was played by President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. And so by the end of the 80s, when I and many others were working on some of these arms control treaties, you could trust, to some extent, trust but verify, as Reagan said. You could understand that there were possibilities of working with the other side that could lead to productive agreements and understandings, and that many of those treaties are still in effect today, as I said. It didn't mean we trusted each other, but we understood that the dangers of a conflict are high and need to be worked through in a calm, rational way for the interests of both sides. I don't really trust the Kremlin today, I'll be frank. I think they are very reckless often in their behavior. And we've seen it in Ukraine, we've seen it in Syria, we've seen it, Russia's involvement in Venezuela, Central African Republic, Libya, all over. And there's no ideology there except making Russia great again. And that's a key difference. The other difference, I would say, is that the rise of China. The rise of China makes comparisons to the Cold War relatively obsolete. So every time you talk about, let's say, a new strategic arms treaty, you have to take into account what is China doing. So a lot of my colleagues in Washington spend time debating, is China Russia's friend, or are they just working together? Or should we be nicer to Putin so he will cooperate with us against China? There's all these combinations, and that's very different than the Cold War. Then it was just the U.S. versus the Soviet Union. I gave you a long answer, but...
No. It was really interesting to hear your idea. You mentioned the dangerous situation in the region, especially for Turkey, in the Black Sea area. For example, some days ago, there was such kind of provocation between UK Defender warship and from Russian side. And how would you analyze this situation? And according to this question, I'd like also to ask, how is important the membership of Ukraine to NATO? Because, yeah, please.
Okay, well, first of all, on the Black Sea, of course, it's interesting, Elnor, in the past 5 years, you've seen the competition start in the Baltic region, and then go to Poland, and then forward deployment of NATO troops, and now it's the Black Sea. And it's like reading a book about the Ottoman Empire in 1912. Okay. So this, I think, is a permanent area of geostrategic competition. And this is a direct result of Russia's relative success in Syria. It's a direct result of Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, which, as you know, is heavily militarized. And this provides Russia for a platform to project power to the south and to the southwest beyond Turkey and into the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's a very dangerous situation, and I think you're seeing, for the first time in a while, the West pushing back, sending ships into the Black Sea. You mentioned the Defender, but I think that kind of thing is going to continue. And of course, in that kind of, this whole competition makes it obvious to everybody that Turkey is an incredibly valuable U.S. partner and NATO partner. And that's why the problems that we all are aware of have to be fixed to allow us to prevent Russia from further expanding its influence. On Ukraine, I think that Ukraine should be a NATO member, period. I think Georgia should be a NATO member, period, and maybe Moldova, period. Now, this is my personal view, I'm quite willing to say that in many key ways, Ukraine is not able yet to be an alliance member. And I understand that, and I agree with that. But I think we have to be very clear that it is going in the right direction, and probably pay more, provide more assistance to make sure that it does go in the right direction. The domestic situation, problem with corruption and all that, we're very well aware of. But they have made progress, despite what the media keeps saying. And one of the dangerous things I always find is that a lot of people believe the Russian narrative about Ukraine. You know, there was no civil war there. There was no, there are no separatists. These are Russian proxy fighters and now regular Russian troops, which are in the eastern part of the country illegally. It's an invasion. And the snatching of Crimea is a good example of that. And Russia has an elaborate narrative about what happened. Very little of it is true. And I think people are realizing that now. So again, I want a firmer commitment to the security of Ukraine, even as we probably push Ukraine harder to make some of the domestic reforms that it needs. I would compliment, by the way, as we talked earlier, I would compliment Turkey for its support for Ukraine, because together you two countries can do a lot. And I think that assistance from Ankara is very much appreciated. I know it is.
You mentioned Turkey's importance. Of course, it is true Turkey is ally with the United States, with NATO. But at the same time, we know that in the last years, for example, Turkey-Russia relations are improved. And they call also as a friend countries each other. And yesterday, for example, foreign ministers of Turkey and Russia met in Antalya in Turkey. So, and of course, you mentioned that, of course, Ukraine should be a member of NATO, but I'd like to mention the statement of Putin, which yesterday, if I'm not forgotten, he mentioned that Russia believes that Western countries, especially United States, cannot start Third World War against us, because they know that they will lose if there will be any Third World War. How would you analyze this statement? Why Putin is so believe himself that Russia would win this kind of war?
Well, first of all, you asked about, I didn't get all your question. Your voice broke a little bit.
Okay.
Let me answer both parts of your question. Number one, Turkey has every right to deal with whatever country it wants to deal with. And I think Turkey is not just a NATO member. Turkey is, and understandably sees itself as an important player in the Middle East, as a big gateway to Central Asia, and as an important regional power. It is. However, Turkey also has alliance obligations. And I think I don't want to comment on other countries. I think the importance of those obligations has to be reinforced to Turkey. But I think it's also very clear that the United States appreciates Turkey's role in the alliance and wants to make it a little less contentious and a little less controversial. So I'll put it that way. But I don't think anybody would deny Turkey its aspirations to be an important regional power. It already is. The S-400 issue, we can stay away from. I'm hopeful that there will be some progress on that. As for Putin, I hate to bring up the image again, but I will. He's like a teenage boy, a delinquent. If he gets away with a lot of stuff, he's going to keep pushing. And I think it's very important to push back in a focused, understandable, clearly articulated direction. And I think he will not do anything crazy, because no one would win a third world war. And he hasn't invented a threat from NATO. There's no threat from NATO to Russia. Russia's invading its neighbors. Ukraine has every right to join NATO. Ukraine has every right to vote for a closer relationship with the West. And Putin has trouble understanding that. But on the other hand, beneath the tough words, it's also true that Putin has not gone further in Ukraine. He stopped more or less where he was in 2014. I'd like to think that the sanctions, the Western pressure, the opposition of countries like Turkey to the really, I'll say it, the stupid Russian invasion of Donetsk, that has made a difference. Russia has not pulled back, but Russia has suffered. And Putin knows, I'm sure, that if he tries anything else, Estonia or wherever, there are going to be consequences. So to some extent, that call-in show is dedicated to his domestic audience. He likes to talk tough. He has a constituency to satisfy on his political right flank. And I'm sure he believes maybe what he said, but I don't think there will be a third world war. And certainly if there were, everybody would lose, not just the United States. And I would add Elnor, that the activity around the world that Russia engages in, and I mentioned Venezuela, Africa, Syria, those are quiet reflections of Russia's awareness that they cannot compete economically or militarily with the West. So that's what they try. They can't do it face to face. So they do the second level gray area export of malign influence. So you'll see Russian narratives broadcast to Turkey on the Russian media. You'll see all of this stuff going on, especially in Eastern Europe. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And the answer to me is just be firm, develop, as the communique said, strong resilience to this kind of Russian influence. Because the threat is not just guns and airplanes and submarines. The threat is Russia's attempt to undermine confidence in the West, confidence in NATO, confidence of Turks in their own government. That's what Russia seeks to do, and it's much cheaper and sometimes more safe than starting a war. Unfortunately, he did that in Ukraine, and now, after many casualties, he still hasn't succeeded in overrunning Ukraine. So that's a good example of resilience.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I'd like to ask a question about Afghanistan. How do you think why NATO or United States withdraw its military from Afghanistan after 20 years? We know that, and it will be more dangerous. It's my own understanding that, as we know, the Taliban took a lot of territory under its own control. So why do you think that NATO decided, or United States decided, withdraw from Afghanistan in this period?
I'll say this is my personal view.
Of course.
Not that of the alliance or the U.S. government. I think that they assessed that this is about as much as they could do, given the amount of money they wanted to spend. And it's a very, very messy, unsatisfying outcome, if this is indeed the outcome. So I have misgivings about the pullback. If I were president, and of course I'm not, I would not have pulled back so precipitously as NATO did. But there are people who criticize the Biden administration for not consulting the allies well enough in advance. And this has to do not only with Afghanistan, but also Nord Stream pipeline and all of that. I think some of the allies, perhaps even Turkey, wish that NATO and the U.S. had talked to them more about this decision. And I think, well, I understand the judgment, the decision that it's not worth keeping this going forever. I understand it, don't necessarily agree. I think that the alliance management part of it is very important. One thing you see with the new administration is there's a strong attempt to build up its relationships with the NATO partners and one-on-one. There will be with Turkey, France, Germany. The Biden people very much want to build up that relationship, those relationships. And that means they have to pick sometimes between pressuring Germany about Nord Stream or canceling, pulling back from the sanctions that the people had hoped would cancel the project. So you're going to see now in the Biden administration these two, not competing, these different policy impulses. Be tough on Russia, but build up confidence with allies. And they're off to, I would say, a start which has been much criticized. But that's what I think they're trying to do. And I know Turkey's played a role in Afghanistan as well. So it's tough. I helped set up the first Radio Liberty broadcast bureau in Kabul about 20 years ago. So I know firsthand what those people are going through. So that's about I can say. I wish it had turned out better, for cheaper and less human life and more quickly. But that's what the White House has decided to do. And I'm sure there will be some lower level commitment to peacekeeping and the status quo, but we'll just have to see.
Okay, because I had asked the question because there are a lot of commentaries, especially from Russian experts. Maybe you have also read that after withdrawal of United States from Afghanistan, then Taliban will turn to Central Asia, and it will make harder these Russian and Chinese policies in Central Asia, because the Central Asian region will become a dangerous place with more conflicts because of Taliban, and Russia and China will focus their military in Central Asian region. That is one of the reasons why United States or Trump and the Trump administration decided.
So, Elnur, you're saying that we pulled out of Afghanistan so the Taliban could fight the Russians and Chinese?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think I'm sure people who were responsible for the decision thought about that, but I think one can overemphasize conspiracies and complicated international games to the point where it doesn't reflect reality at all. This happens with the Russia-China-U.S. debate all the time. You know, who do we help? Who's the bigger threat? And this is not a game of billiards in a bar in New York City. These are real countries with really complex situations. And while it may be the case that the Taliban draws down Chinese and Russian forces, I'm certain that was not a major factor in the U.S. decision.
Okay, thank you very much. Then I'd like, we are now at the end of our panel. We have 10 minutes approximately. Now I'd like to ask a question concerning to Turkey-United States relations. Especially, it is also important to ask and to know your personal view, your institution's view concerning to the crisis between Turkey and the United States in the last year. So one of them, for example, S-400, this missile defense system crisis. The second is a U.S. support to YPG, as Turkey calls terrorist groups, continuation of PKK terrorist group. So how would you analyze the general situation? You mentioned the importance of Turkey. I know Turkey is strategic ally. Is the strategic ally is on the paper right now, or it is also realistic that even there are a lot of crises, we can call this kind of relations a strategic ally? So please.
Well, I again, I don't want to sound too optimistic, but Turkey is a strategic ally, period. It's a NATO member. It has excellent armed forces, all those things we've talked about, people write about. And I think you're going to see an attempt by the Biden administration to repair the relationship. On the S-400s, I think you could probably come to a solution. I don't want to prejudge it or give details because I'm not an expert on that. But I do think you can. On the support for the PKK, I'm less optimistic. I think, as you know, the United States puts a great deal of emphasis on human rights, democratic development, and those kinds of things. And if anything, El-Nur, you're seeing the Biden administration talk about it much more than President Trump did. So I think that's not going to change. I think it might help, perhaps, if the U.S. paid more overt attention to some of the burdens, for example, that Turkey is bearing up because of the Syrian war and the refugees. I think people who follow the issue realize that. But I do not think that the support is likely to diminish. And both sides are going to have to realize the broader point that they are strategic partners, even if they choose to disagree on specific issues. I would say the same thing with the Armenian genocide thing recently, declaration. You're going to have a disagreement. And both sides, President Erdogan and President Biden, I think, realize at the bottom that the relationship needs fixing, but it's very important. And I think they're going to focus probably on that. I would add that, we have disagreements with Britain, France, and Germany. This is not the only alliance relationship that is troubled sometimes. It's probably more troubled than our relationship with those two countries. But I would not give up hope, and I do think, especially on the S-400s, that there will be some kind of an understanding on both sides about where to go next.
Thank you very much. Again, as I mentioned, we are in the end of our panel. Let me ask the last question, the general question, your personal view. How would you see the future of the security of our world in 5 years, for example, or in 10 years? How in 2030, how the world would be look like, the world?
I think we could have had the whole panel just on this. I think that in terms of our analysis looking forward, I think we are largely on the right track in terms of understanding what will likely happen. However, I was there when the Soviet Union collapsed and nobody expected it. I would say that I would never rule out the possibility of abrupt, the government, they call them in the literature, the abrupt discontinuity, occurring quickly when one of these countries, in particular Russia, I expect, even if Putin were not there, an aggressive foreign policy more or less like this one. But I just do not assume that Putin will be there automatically for the next 20 years, as people speak as though he would be. The Soviet Union disappeared like that, and people were surprised. So we should be prepared for anything, and I think that in particular involves Russia. On China, I have no reason to disagree with the predictions that China will become the major competitor, it is already, to the United States. But I do not think we should assume that China's rise will be automatic or as easy as it has been so far. People assume that it will be, but I'm not yet convinced. Remember, you were probably too young to remember, but in 1985 or 6, people talked about Japan as the next great. All these books were written about Japan. Before that, it was other countries. So I would just be careful when we see all these predictions, including the one from the NATO report here. Be careful that we just don't believe our own predictions, because life is never as smooth and linear as it seems on paper. So I would be, and it's a very unsatisfying thing to say, I would be prepared for anything.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr.
My pleasure.
Jensen. It was great, really, to hear your analysis.
Thank you.
I hope that in future we will also continue our cooperation.
I'm ready anytime, and USIP, a great institution, says hello, and thank you for your work.
Okay, on behalf of BILGESAM, I'd like also to thank you.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Jensen. Thank
Talk to
you.
you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.